At 3:47 hours, a hedgerow line west of La Haye-du-Puits, Normandy, July 8, 1944. The corn was taller than a man. That was the only mercy left. Private Eli Ridge lay flat between two rows, mud pressed into his collar, breath held so long his ribs ached. 20 meters away, boots moved through wet earth. German boots. 8 of them, maybe more. He couldn't see faces. He didn't need to. His left hand drifted to his wrist, to the braided cord of corn husk tied there, faded from 3 years of sweat and rain. He touched it once, just once. Then his hand moved on to the rifle beside him, a weapon that shouldn't have existed, built from parts that were never meant to meet. He had been told never to do this again. 3 weeks earlier, a colonel had stood in front of his entire company and called his tracking method superstition. Called him something worse. Told him if he ever moved through brush like that again, silent, low, invisible, he'd be written up for insubordination. Tonight, insubordination was the only thing standing between 16 German riflemen and the 12 wounded men waiting in a ditch 400 meters behind him. The nearest German stopped walking, turned his head, listened. Eli did not move, did not breathe. The corn held still around him like it was holding its own breath too. Somewhere behind him, 400 meters of open ground and one drainage ditch separated him from 12 wounded men who would not survive until sunrise without help. Somewhere ahead of him, 16 trained riflemen and a machine gun crew stood between him and every single one of them. Remember that number, 16. By the time the corn stopped moving, it would matter more than anyone standing in that field could have guessed. Somewhere behind those enemy lines, a man was about to learn why they should have listened to him. What happened in the next 11 minutes would never make it into an official after-action report. Not fully, not honestly, but it happened. And by the time the sun came up over that cornfield, 16 men who had walked in on 2 legs would not walk out at all. This is the story the U.S. Army didn't want told the way it actually happened. Like and subscribe if forgotten soldiers deserve to be remembered. Pull back 6 hours, 2140 hours. Same hedgerow sector. Eli Ridge's platoon, 31 men of the 90th Infantry Division, had been ordered to hold a crossroad nobody on the map thought mattered. Normandy's bocage country was a killing maze of sunken lanes and 1,000-year-old hedgerows, walls of packed earth and root 3 feet thick, and the Germans had spent 4 years learning every angle of fire inside it. American doctrine hadn't caught up. Tanks stalled at the hedges. Riflemen died trying to cross open gaps between them. It was, by July of 1944, one of the worst killing grounds in the entire European theater. Eli's platoon didn't know it yet, but they'd walked into the seam between 2 German positions. A reinforced squad of Wehrmacht riflemen backed by an MG-42 machine gun nest, 16 men in total, dug into the tree line with fields of fire covering every approach. The Americans had rifles, a few grenades, and one working radio with a dead battery. Enemy POV. He reads the runner's report twice. American platoon pinned, disorganized, no armor support. Routine. He has broken a dozen platoons like this one since June. He tells his second-in-command to hold position and let the Americans exhaust themselves against the wall before dawn. It is not arrogance. It is arithmetic. 16 trained riflemen behind earth and root against 30 tired boys with wet rifles. He goes back to his coffee. He does not think about it again that night. The Germans had chosen their ground with brutal precision. The MG-42 nest sat angled to sweep the only gap wide enough for a man to cross without climbing the earthen wall itself, and interlocking rifle positions on either flank meant any approach outside that single gap walked straight into crossfire. American commanders up and down the line were only beginning to understand that July, that the hedgerow country favored the dug-in defender in almost every configuration a rifle platoon could attempt. Eli's platoon was about to become one more data point in that brutal lesson. By 100 hours, the platoon's lieutenant was dead, a sniper round through the throat during a failed crossing. Command fell to a sergeant who froze. 12 men were wounded and unmovable, dragged into a drainage ditch behind a stone wall 400 meters from the German line. No radio contact, no artillery support, no way to call for it even if they had. That left 19 able-bodied men, no officer, and 16 entrenched enemy riflemen with a machine gun that could shred a hedgerow gap in under 2 seconds. Do the math. 19 tired, leaderless men, 16 dug-in Germans with automatic fire and interlocking lanes, and somewhere in the middle of it, one private nobody wanted to listen to. Back at the sergeant's position, Eli had proposed a route low through the corn, avoiding the sunken lanes the Germans had zeroed in. The sergeant cut him off in front of the whole squad. "We don't do voodoo tracking out here, Ridge. We move like soldiers or we don't move at all." 2 men laughed. Nobody argued for him. By 2:30 hours, 3 more attempts to reach the wounded had failed. 1 man was shot through the shoulder just trying to cross 15 meters of open ground. The math was simple and it was brutal. 16 dug-in riflemen with an MG-42 capable of firing over 1,200 rounds a minute against 19 exhausted men with no officer, no radio, and no artillery to call even if the radio worked. 12 German soldiers for every American who could still walk. Do that math. At 2:15 hours, a corporal tried crawling toward the wounded through a gap in the hedge and was caught in a burst that took off 2 fingers before he made it back. At 2:22 hours, a second man froze halfway across open ground and had to be dragged back by his collar while tracer rounds chewed the earth 6 inches from his skull. Every failed attempt cost time, and time, in a sector with no reinforcement scheduled before 600, was the one resource nobody could manufacture. It was, by every rule, the U.S. Army had trained into these men, an impossible position. Eli Ridge was born in 1922 in a hollow outside Ellijay, Georgia, where his mother's cornfields ran up against the tree line like they were daring the mountains to take the land back. His mother was white, a Ridge by marriage. His grandfather, Sequia Walker, was Cherokee, one of the last in that county who still remembered the old ways of moving through timber without a sound. His grandfather taught him before the county school ever did. How to read a broken stem. How to place a heel before a toe. How the wind moves differently through corn than through hardwood, and how a man's whole body could disappear into 8 feet of green stalks if he understood the difference between walking at the land and walking with it. "The corn doesn't hide you," his grandfather told him once, hands weathered as bark. "The corn teaches you how to be still enough that you were never really there." His grandfather braided the first cord the week Eli turned 12, corn husk fiber, dried and worked soft, tied in a pattern that had no name in English. "For walking quiet," the old man said. "For remembering who taught you." Eli wore it every day after that. He never took it off, not once, not even the day 3 men from the county cut his grandfather's fence line and called him a word Eli would carry in his chest for the rest of his life. His mother taught him the corn itself, how to read a field like a language, which rows caught wind first, which stalks bent and sprang back clean, and which one snapped and told on you. She'd grown up poor in that hollow and never once apologized for marrying a man the county gossiped about. She used to say the corn didn't care whose blood you carried, only whether you'd learned to listen to it. Eli believed her longer than he believed almost anyone else in his life. That word followed him into the Army. In basic training, a drill sergeant heard he was part Indian and made him demonstrate his tracking in front of the company like a circus act, then mocked the very thing he'd asked him to do. Other men avoided bunking near him. He was passed over for a squad leader slot he'd earned twice. He learned early that his skill would get him laughed at long before it got him respected. There was a night in England, 3 weeks before the invasion, when a staff sergeant found him practicing his grandfather's low crawl through a hedge behind the camp mess tent and reported it as erratic behavior unbecoming a soldier. Eli was made to stand at attention for 2 hours in the rain while the sergeant explained, loudly, in front of the assembling company, that the United States Army did not train men to slither through dirt like animals. Nobody defended him. He stood there and said nothing, rain running down the back of his collar, one thumb pressed against the cord at his wrist the entire time. His gun knowledge came from his Uncle Tom, a blacksmith and part-time gunsmith who fixed hunting rifles for half the county during the Depression because nobody could afford a new one. Eli spent his boyhood afternoons in that shop, learning how a barrel's rifling changed a bullet's flight, how a trigger group could be cleaned and reset by feel alone, how 2 broken guns could sometimes make one good one if a man understood why each part existed and not just what it was called. He lost his older brother, Daniel, at Anzio in February. The telegram came 3 days before Eli shipped out to England. He never spoke about it. He simply started sharpening things, knives, bayonets. His own attention, like grief, was a whetstone, and he intended to use every bit of it. Daniel had been the one who defended him loudest as a boy, the one who'd broken a knuckle on a schoolyard bully's jaw for repeating what his grandfather had been called at the feed store. Eli kept one of Daniel's old service photographs folded inside his field jacket, though he never mentioned it, never showed it, and never let it become the thing people talked about when they talked about him. Grief in his family was carried the way his grandfather carried silence privately and completely. By the time basic training ended, instructors had learned to stop underestimating the quiet private who never spoke unless spoken to, and somehow always seemed to know exactly where a wounded man's arterial pressure point was, or how far a scope's zero would drift in humid heat, without ever having attended the classes that covered it. He'd learned all of it standing at his uncle's workbench, listening more than talking, the same way he'd learned everything that would eventually save 12 men's lives in a French cornfield. By the time he reached Normandy, Eli Ridge was a 19-year-old private with the tracking instincts of a man twice his age, the mechanical mind of a trained gunsmith, and a war inside him that had nothing to do with Germany at all. He didn't fight for glory. He fought because silence, for once in his life, was going to mean something other than being unheard. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the men history left out of the textbooks. By 2:55 hours, the sergeant was dead, killed leading a 4th failed crossing that everyone but Eli had warned against. Command, what was left of it, fell to nobody. 18 men remained able-bodied. 12 wounded lay in the ditch, out of morphine, out of time. Eli didn't ask permission this time. There was no one left to ask. He stripped his gear to the essentials, rifle, knife, 4 grenades, the cord still knotted at his wrist, and moved into the corn alone. Behind him in the ditch, a wounded corporal named Walter Okonkwo watched him go and would later say it was the last time he expected to see him alive. Nobody tried to stop him. Nobody had a better idea left to offer. No radio, no backup, no orders, just a decision. At 3:11 hours, his first attempt to flank the machine gun nest went wrong. A root under the mud rolled his ankle, and for 3 full seconds he was audible, a scrape of boot against stalk that any trained ear would catch. A German rifleman turned his light toward the sound. Eli went flat, face in the wet earth, heart slamming against his ribs, and waited 11 full minutes without moving a muscle before the light swept away. Enemy POV. A runner reports a noise near the eastern flank, investigated, nothing found. Voss barely looks up. Then at 3:22, a second report. A rifleman near the machine gun position is missing. Not wounded, not hurt, simply gone. Voss sets down his coffee. He asks his second-in-command a question he has never had to ask in this sector before. Gone where? No one has an answer. For the first time tonight, he feels something he does not have a German word comfortable enough to use. He orders the perimeter tightened. 14 minutes gone, 12 wounded men still waiting. 16 Germans who had no idea their line had already been breached. At 3:34 hours, Eli found the missing rifleman himself, a sentry he'd taken down silently at close range, using nothing but the flat of his hand and the leverage his Uncle Tom had taught him breaking up fistfights outside the shop. He took the man's ammunition. He did not report it. There was no one to report it to, and 12 wounded men in a ditch needed those rounds more than a body needed a formality observed over it. He felt nothing about it in the moment. That would come later, if it came at all. The sentry had been younger than Eli by the look of him, a boy from some conscript intake who had probably never expected to end a war folded into Norman mud without a sound. Eli did not close the boy's eyes. He did not say anything over him. He took the ammunition, checked the wind, and moved on because the 12 men in that ditch did not have the luxury of his hesitation, and neither tonight did he. 14 riflemen left, 1 machine gun crew, and a jammed weapon he hadn't built yet. His plan required a weapon he didn't have. The M1 Garand he carried was reliable but loud in the confined lanes of the hedgerows, its distinct ping of an ejecting clip a dead giveaway to any German who'd learned the sound, and they had all learned the sound. What he needed was something that could kill silently at close range, repeatedly, without giving away his position after the first shot. He had the sentry's carabiner 98K bolt action, but with a barrel and iron sight assembly machined with a precision the wartime Garand couldn't match at short range. He had his own Garand's semi-automatic action and 8-round clip, faster to follow up than any bolt gun. And in his kit, wrapped in oilcloth the way his uncle had taught him to protect tools from Georgia humidity, he carried a spare oil filter canister and a fistful of steel wool. The same crude suppressor trick men in his uncle's shop used to quiet a barn cat problem without waking the whole hollow. He laid the pieces out on his jacket in the mud, the way his Uncle Tom had taught him to lay out a disassembled rifle, so his hands would always know where each part belonged even in the dark. The Garand's receiver group, still warm from his own body heat. The Kar 98K's barrel, cooler, foreign, but precisely machined in a way that made his uncle's old lessons about German tooling come rushing back. Tighter tolerances, better metal, built by men who'd had 4 extra years and a state armory behind them. Neither weapon alone solved his problem. The Garand cycled fast, but announced itself with a metallic ping every 8 rounds that could be heard 50 meters off in a quiet hedgerow. The Kar 98K was accurate and quiet at the muzzle but slow to reload, useless against more than one man at close range. A Thompson would have solved the volume of fire, but was hopeless for the kind of precision a silenced approach demanded, and he had neither the ammunition nor the time to carry one anyway. He needed the Corn's lesson applied to steel, not brute force, but the right combination, moving with the terrain instead of against it. His hands worked in the dark by feel alone. He stripped the Garand's barrel from its stock, matched the Kar 98K's tighter tolerance muzzle threading against it using a section of German bayonet lug he filed down with a boot heel edge, and packed the oil filter canister with steel wool baffles to catch and slow the expanding gas. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't regulation. It was a half-German, half-American hybrid held together by desperation and a gunsmith's memory of why each part mattered. The Garand's speed of follow-up fire, the Kar 98K's tighter barrel accuracy at close range, and a suppressor built from a farm boy's oldest trick. The threading alone took him 9 minutes he didn't have. He filed the bayonet lug down against the flat of a rock, testing the fit against the Garand's muzzle every 30 seconds by touch, careful never to let metal strike metal loud enough to carry. Twice he heard boots nearby and went motionless mid-motion, file still gripped in his fist, waiting out the danger the same way his grandfather had taught him to wait out a spooked deer. When the fit finally seated clean, he packed the oil filter canister with steel wool in 3 tight layers, leaving just enough of a gas path for the action to still cycle without blowing the makeshift baffles apart on the first shot. It was crude engineering built on a boy's memory of quieting a barn cat problem, applied now to something with far higher stakes than a chicken coop. His scarred knuckles, split from the sentry's collar, brushed the cornhusk cord at his wrist as he worked. He didn't look at it. He didn't need to. The first test came at 3:41 hours against a second sentry 40 meters out. 1 round. A sound like a hand clapped once, softly, and then nothing. The man folded without a cry. Eli's chest heaved. Adrenaline and disbelief tangled together. It worked. He allowed himself 4 seconds of stillness to confirm it. No shouted alarm, no return fire, no shift in the rhythm of the German line. 4 seconds was all the war was going to give him to feel anything about what he had just built and what it had just done. Then he moved again, deeper into the hedge line, toward the machine gun position that had pinned his entire platoon for 6 hours straight. 2 riflemen left silent behind him, 14 still ahead. And the gap in the earthwork his grandfather's teaching had shown him was still 6 minutes away. Enemy POV. 2 men unaccounted for now. No shots heard by the main line, none that could be explained. Voss walks the position himself, something he has not done in weeks, and finds a sentry's post empty with no sign of struggle. He orders lights doused and men into pairs. His second-in-command asks if this is an American infiltration unit. Voss does not answer immediately. When he finally speaks, his voice carries an edge his men have not heard from him before. One man cannot do this. He is no longer certain that is true. At 3:49 hours, Eli's rebuilt weapon jammed on its 4th cycle, a stovepipe malfunction from the improvised threading, brass caught crooked in the makeshift suppressor housing. 2 Germans, alerted by the sound of a nearby patrol going silent, closed toward his position with rifles raised. He had 4 seconds and a broken weapon. This was his lowest point. Wounded already from a graze across his forearm during the earlier crossing, bleeding into his sleeve, out of a clear plan, surrounded by men who would kill him without hesitation, and a war that had already taken his brother. For 1 full second, Eli Ridge considered simply staying flat in the mud and letting the dawn find him, alive, hidden, and useless. His hand found the cord at his wrist instead. He didn't pray with it, the way some men held a rosary. He just held it the way his grandfather had held it before him, the way 3 generations had held it through things that had no good words attached to them. The corn doesn't hide you. It teaches you how to be still enough that you were never really there. He wasn't hiding anymore. He understood that now, in the mud, with a jammed rifle and 2 men closing on his position. This was never about being unseen. It was about choosing the exact moment to be seen, and by whom. He cleared the jam by feel in under 6 seconds, the way his Uncle Tom had taught him to clear a hunting rifle blind in a dark blind before dawn. He rose from the corn like something the field itself had produced. Comment below if you've ever had to trust the thing you were told to be ashamed of. 3:52 hours. The 2 Germans never got a shot off. Eli's rebuilt weapon spoke twice, and the sound it made was almost gentle for what it did. 3:57 hours. He reached the machine gun nest itself. 2 men serving the MG-42, 3 more riflemen in support positions along the hedge line. This was the peak of the German defense, and the heart of everything holding the American wounded pinned in that ditch. He counted the seam his grandfather had taught him to look for, the place where 2 fields of fire almost, but not quite, overlapped, a gap no wider than a man's shoulders. Every rifle range in Georgia, every hour spent low in the corn learning to be a shape the land didn't notice, had been building toward this exact 11 feet of open ground. His side burned where the earlier graze had reopened, blood sticky against his ribs, but his hands were steady in the way his uncle's hands used to go steady over a workbench when a job mattered more than anything else in the room. He counted his remaining rounds by feel, 19 left in the hybrid rifle's clip. No spares. Whatever happened next would happen with exactly what he was carrying and nothing more. First peek. He took the two MG-42 gunners in under 4 seconds, moving through the gap in the hedgerow his grandfather's teaching had shown him existed, a seam of shadow no training manual in any army had ever mapped. The hybrid rifle performed beyond anything he'd hoped, silent, precise, devastating at close range exactly where a Garand would have been too loud and a bolt gun too slow. Second peek, it nearly ended there. A sixth German, a reserve rifleman Eli hadn't accounted for, caught movement and opened fire wildly into the dark. A round tore through Eli's side below the ribs, and he went down hard against the earthwork, the world narrowing to a single point of white pain and the taste of blood in his mouth. For a moment, sprawled against the German position he just silenced, he could not move his legs. 400 hours. Blood soaked through his jacket in a widening dark stain he could feel more than see. Every instinct his body had left told him to stay down, to let the dark and the mud finish what the corn had started, to disappear the way he'd been taught to disappear his whole life. For one full breath, he considered it. Then his hand found the cord at his wrist one final time. Third peek. He forced himself upright using the machine gun's own tripod, and in the 4 seconds it took the 6th rifleman to work the bolt on his weapon for a second shot, Eli fired the last rounds in his hybrid rifle's clip and ended it. Then, weapon empty, wounded, alone, he turned the captured MG-42 itself around and used it, the enemy's own gun, in an American private's bleeding hands, to break the will of the remaining German riflemen along that hedge line, who broke and scattered rather than face fire from a position that should have been theirs. Stop. Look at what just happened. 90th Infantry Division, Hedgerow Sector west of La Haye-du-Puits, July 8, 1944, 3:11 to 4:02 hours. Before, enemy position. 16 riflemen, 1 MG-42 emplacement dug in behind Earthandroot hedgerow cover, friendly forces available to Ridge. 1 man, 1 improvised hybrid rifle, 23 rounds of ammunition, 4 grenades. After, enemy casualties confirmed. 11 killed, 3 wounded and captured, 2 fled the position, ground retaken. The entire hedgerow line and machine gun position, approximately 60 meters of critical crossroad ground, American lives saved estimated. 12 wounded men in the drainage ditch, all recovered alive by 4:30 hours, ammunition expended by Ridge. 19 rounds from the hybrid rifle, remainder from the captured MG-42, time elapsed. 51 minutes. 1 man. Those numbers, sit with that. No air support, no artillery barrage, no armor, just a private with a jury-rigged rifle built from a dead man's parts and a lifetime of lessons the Army had told him were useless. Enemy POV. Voss walks the recaptured ground himself at first light, past his own machine gun turned against his own men, past sentries who died without firing a shot, and finds a single set of boot prints leading through corn that should have been impossible to move through silently. He says nothing for a long moment. His second-in-command asks for orders. Voss looks at the corn, still swaying faintly though there is no wind, and says the only thing he will ever say about that night for the rest of his life. We were beaten by a ghost who knew how to walk. He does not report it as an anomaly. He reports it as a lesson. The silence after was its own kind of event. No cheering, no relief. Just 18 exhausted American soldiers watching one private walk out of the corn carrying a machine gun that wasn't his, blood soaking through his side, saying nothing at all. Nobody spoke to him for almost a full minute. Then someone nobody remembers who simply reached out and steadied him by the shoulder as he swayed. That was all. That was enough. Subscribe if a moment like that deserves more than silence. By 500 hours, medics reached the recaptured crossroad and began treating both the 12 American wounded and the 3 surviving German prisoners with the same triage priority, a detail several veterans later cited as the moment they understood the war they were fighting still had rules worth keeping, even after a night like that one. The immediate aftermath was almost anticlimactic by design. The 12 wounded men were recovered alive by 4:30 hours. The crossroad held. 3 days later, Operation Cobra's opening moves would push through that same stretch of hedgerow country, and the men who planned it never knew how close it had come to being contested ground instead of a clear staging line. Eli Ridge received a Silver Star recommendation from a captain who hadn't witnessed the action himself, but had pieced it together from survivors' accounts. The recommendation was downgraded twice in review, once unofficially because a colonel's report from 3 weeks earlier calling Ridge's tracking methods conduct unbecoming was still sitting in his file. He received a Bronze Star instead, awarded quietly, without ceremony in October of 1944. The division's own after-action summary for that sector, filed weeks later, credited the recapture of the crossroad to effective small unit action, without naming a single soldier involved. It is the kind of sentence that has buried 1,000 acts of individual heroism inside the bureaucratic language of a war too large to remember every name it owed a debt to. Eli Ridge's name appears exactly once in the division's surviving records from that week, misspelled, in a supply requisition for replacement ammunition dated 3 days after the battle. Witness testimony. We didn't believe he could do it. Half of us had laughed at him 3 weeks before. I was in that ditch, shot through the shoulder, and I heard exactly one sound the whole time, this soft clap twice, then nothing. I found out years later that was supposed to be impossible with the rifles we carried. Nobody told him it was impossible. He'd already built something that wasn't listening to what was possible. Historians studying hedgerow warfare adaptation later noted that Ridge's improvised close-quarters weapon and low-profile movement techniques were informally passed between several squads in the division before Operation Cobra began, though no official record credits him by name. The innovations simply appear in after-action reports as field-adapted infiltration methods, authorless, as so many soldier-born solutions were. Corporal Walter Okonkwo, one of the 12 wounded men pulled from that ditch, spent the rest of his life telling anyone who would listen that a private the Army had once threatened to court-martial for conduct unbecoming was the only reason he lived to see his own children grow up. Okonkwo tried twice, in the 1960s and again in the 1980s, to petition for a formal review of Ridge's award, believing the Silver Star recommendation had been buried unfairly. Both petitions stalled in administrative review and were never resolved before either man died. The 2 men stayed in occasional contact for the rest of their lives, exchanging letters at Christmas, and it was Okonkwo's 1987 testimony, recorded for a local veterans' oral history project, that preserved the only detailed first-hand account of what happened in that cornfield outside of Ridge's own brief, guarded recollections to his family. The ammunition Ridge took from the dead sentry, before reporting the encounter, was never formally addressed. It appears nowhere in his file. Those who knew about it never spoke of it, and Ridge himself never mentioned it in the 2 brief interviews he gave decades later. It exists only in what men in that ditch chose to remember and chose to let go. He was never promoted past private first class. He returned to Ellijay, Georgia, in 1946, took over his Uncle Tom's gunsmith shop, and rarely spoke about the war to anyone outside his own family. His grandfather Sequia died in 1951, 3 years before Eli finally told his own son the story of a night in a Normandy cornfield. And even then, he told it plainly, without embellishment, the way his grandfather had taught him to tell everything that mattered. The county that had mocked him never issued an apology. There wasn't one to give, and Eli never asked for it. The colonel who had called his method, "conduct unbecoming," 3 weeks before the battle was rotated out of the division that autumn and never crossed paths with Eli again. There is no record that he ever learned what happened in that cornfield, or that the private he'd humiliated in front of his company was the reason a crossroad critical to Operation Cobra's opening advance was still in American hands. Eli never sought him out to tell him. His grandfather had taught him that some silences were worth more than any correction ever could be. The cornhusk cord survived the war on his wrist. He wore it until his death in 1994. It was buried with him, at his own request, in a small cemetery outside Ellijay, within sight of a cornfield that still belongs to his family today. There are thousands of stories like this one buried in division archives, private letters, and the memories of men who are almost all gone now. Most of them will never make it onto a screen. Most of them were never written down with the weight they deserved in the first place. Eli Ridge fought a war on 2 fronts, one against an enemy dug into French hedgerows, and one against his own side's willingness to see what was standing in front of them the whole time. There is one detail the official record does not explain. Weeks after the action, a German sentry's body was found nearly a kilometer from the hedgerow line, in the opposite direction of the German retreat, with no unit identification and no American patrol reporting contact anywhere near that position. No investigation was opened. No one connected it to the events of July 8th. No one ever asked Eli Ridge about it, and he died in 1994 without volunteering an answer. Maybe it means nothing. Maybe it was simply a lost man who wandered too far in the dark. Or maybe it means something he chose, like his grandfather taught him, to carry in silence rather than speech. Every generation carries men like Eli Ridge, people whose knowledge is dismissed right up until the moment it's the only thing standing between disaster and survival. And even then, credit rarely follows understanding. The army that mocked his tracking method never rewrote its doctrine to thank him for it. History rarely issues corrections. It simply moves on, and it is up to the people who come after to decide whether a name gets carried forward or left in a supply requisition, misspelled, one line among thousands. If this story found you, if his name meant nothing to you an hour ago and now it means something, leave his name in the comments. Just his name, nothing else. Let's build him a memorial right here in this comment section where history forgot to put one. Subscribe, because there are hundreds more of them, forgotten, waiting, and they deserve to be found.